The next day I tried to be even less noticeable than usual around Brock. He was in a black mood, snapping at the officers and men, and when he noticed me, snapping at me. Our one advantage over the Yankees was our trained and disciplined infantry, and now the infantry was mutinying. I groaned to myself when a messenger came and said Brock needed me. He was eating with the officers that night. His uniform was already laid out for tomorrow. I'd hoped to keep out of his way until Evans was back and the mutiny settled, but it was too much to hope for. I reached the door of the officers' mess just as a young private came out sweating. He gave me a quick look that said it was hell in there, then scurried off. I took a breath and knocked on the door. Come. Half a dozen officers were sitting around the large oak table, their food cold and half-eaten. Brock was at the far end of the table. Private Fields. He was even more stern and formal than usual. We would like to ask you some questions. You may rest assured your answers will be treated in confidence and nothing you say will be used against you. Do you understand? Yes, sir. I didn't understand. You were born in Upper Canada and volunteered for the service just before the outbreak of war. Is that correct? I nodded. He knew that. Have you heard about the mutiny at Queenston? I swallowed. Was I in trouble? Should I lie? But I knew Brock better than to lie to him. Yes, sir. It has, I take it, become common knowledge among the men. I panicked. He knew I'd overheard his conversation with Evans. He thought I'd told everyone. But I hadn't. I hadn't said a word. The soldiers got wind of the revolt the way soldiers get wind of everything that happens. I didn't say a word, sir. Brock almost smiled. I'm sure you didn't, Fields. You've always impressed me with your ability to hear things you shouldn't and not repeat them. The other officers chuckled. They all had Batman and probably all shared the same jokes about them. There are other colonial regulars in this army. Do you think they are loyal? It shocked me. A British officer was asking a volunteer private if the other volunteers were loyal. Now I knew why the private had been sweating. He was one of the regulars from England. He'd probably been asked the same question about them. All the men are loyal, sir. It was a smart thing to say, and true, too. I'd never heard anyone talk mutiny. They complained a lot. The food tasted better if you complained about it, but they were loyal. I'm glad to hear it, Fields. Brock leaned back in his chair. I have always believed the men were loyal, but as you know, I was not entirely correct. Every man I know is loyal, sir. We would follow you anywhere. We already had. Brock nodded. I sent for you, Fields, because I know you're not afraid to speak the truth. He grimaced. No matter how unpleasant. I am reassured by your report. That is all. I turned to go. I was sweating too. Being honest around British officers had its price. I was halfway to the door when Evans burst in. He was soaking wet. His breath came in gasps. He didn't bother to salute, but threw himself into a chair. General Brock, the Americans! He was so out of breath he could barely speak. The Americans are about to attack. Get him some wine. Brock was out of his chair and striding toward Evans. I ran to the sideboard, poured a glass of port, and brought it to Evans. He drank the glass in a gulp. Thank you. Another, please. I haven't eaten yet today. I gathered up some bread and cheese from the table and brought over the decanter of port. What happened, Evans? Brock grabbed Evans' chair and leaned over him. For a moment I thought he was going to grab the major, shake the news loose. Sir! Evans gulped some more port and bit off a slice of the bread. Now his mouth was too full to talk. I thought Brock was going to break something. Sir! Evans finally found his voice. I arrived at Queenston to find it under a hail of musket fire from across the river. Captain Dennis said the Americans had made a habit of this lately. I decided I must see at once what was happening. I set off across the river with the local militia captain. He offered a wry smile. The snipers were most unsporting. I believe they used our flag of truce as a target. When I reached the far shore, I was greeted by one of their majors. No senior officer would speak with me. They said, sir, he straightened up in his chair, they said they could not discuss an exchange of prisoners for another 2 days. Sir, I'm convinced they plan to attack tomorrow. Nonsense, one of the colonels lit a cigar. That means nothing. Their senior officers weren't available. A junior officer simply wanted to avoid taking responsibility. That is most likely what happened. Brock let go of Evans' chair. He looked disappointed. For a moment he had hoped the battle was finally about to begin, but Evans had simply got carried away. Sir, there's more. Evans rose unsteadily from his chair. There were thousands of troops on the American side, regular infantry and savage-looking militia. I'm certain they have massed much of their army across the river from Queenston Heights. That makes no sense, another officer protested. Queenston is in the center of our line of defense. Why would they attack there when a flanking attack would be more certain of success? Brock was standing absolutely still, staring at the regimental colors draped on one wall. Everyone knew that stance. He was trying to reach out across the miles and enter the mind of an enemy general. Did you see anything else? He asked Evans. Yes, sir. I saw half a dozen flat-bottomed boats, each able to carry 20 men, hidden in inlets and along the shore, covered with brush and leaves. Who knows how many more there might be? It would be perfectly ordinary for boats to be there, someone said. They might plan to follow their main attack with an attack at Queenston. Or it might be a diversion to draw off troops from our flanks. I think they wanted Evans to see the boats, to fool him. Evans kept his gaze on Brock, who continued to gaze at the wall. Sir, Evans said quietly, I am certain the Americans are about to attack, probably within a few hours. We must prepare. The room was silent. Everyone watched Brock. He was like a pillar standing there motionless, his one hand clenched against his chest, his eyes unfocused, staring through the wall. The night, the rain, toward the distant enemy. No one moved. We were all frozen in Brock's trance. Then he was striding toward the door so quickly, almost violently, that several officers jumped. Evans, follow me. They disappeared into a small room across the hall. The other officers looked at each other, shrugged their shoulders. Someone called for port. The regular servant had disappeared, so I took over. It gave me an excuse to stay. It was almost an hour later when Brock came into the room. I had seen that gray granite look only once before, in York, when he decided to move on Detroit. I'm convinced the Americans are planning an attack, possibly tomorrow. Whether the main attack will come at Queenston or somewhere else, we cannot know. We must be ready. He delivered his orders in a stream, one to each officer. The local militia were to come to the fort tonight. The outlying militia were to rush to their posts as quickly as possible. All troops along the front were to be ready for an attack as early as dawn. The Indians were to be alerted and told they might be needed at any moment. What did you do with the Queenston mutineers? I sent them back to their posts, sir, Evans shrugged. It seemed a poor time to be arresting our own men. Brock scowled. Then the scowl disappeared and he laughed. He actually laughed. If your prediction is correct, Evans, this could be the most fortunate mutiny in history. We shall have to decorate them. Gentlemen, we have a full night ahead. All that night I delivered messages, orders, letters. I returned to Brock's quarters at 3 to find him slumped over his desk, asleep. I left him there, went to the stables, and made sure Alfred was fed and his saddle nearby. I made sure another horse was ready too, one used by messengers riding between forts. Then I threw myself onto my bed. I dreamed of guns and men dying and horses screaming and the endless roar of cannon. Over and over again, I heard the cannon. I half awoke. There was a storm outside. Thunder grumbled in the far distance. I jumped from my bed. The thunder was regular, repeated. It was no dream. It was the sound of cannon. The Americans had attacked.